This is Robert Capuccio. Welcome to the Self-Help Antidote, a weekly dose of reason, perspective, and insight, where we challenge conventional thinking and explore authentic strategies and insights around personal transformation. Our commitment to you is to bring you some of the world's leading experts in the domains of fitness, wellness, coaching, and behavior change, separating fact from fallacy. Chris Grosso, Preston, Fassel, how you doing?
Very well, very well. Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I just jumped right in there. That's how excited I am. I just cut you right off. Because I think this is going to be a little bit different from the normal conversations that we have. Not like we really have normal conversations in Self-Help Antidote. I don't want to give you that impression that we're an overly professional or respectable organization. We kind of have out there conversations many times before, but this is truly unique. If I could just jump in, you just wrote the book, Necessary Death. And you talk about what the horror genre can teach us about ourselves. My obvious question is, where'd you come up with the idea for that book?
Well, I guess I'll begin because it was something for me. I've been very passionate about working with human beings. Like since I was a kid, I've just always had this heart that wanted to help others. Prior to this book, I'd written 3 books in the mental health and wellness field. And I've always had a penchant for horror movies since I was a kid. And I love going to horror conventions and meeting people and nerding out with people. And I was at one up in Worcester, Mass called Rock and Shock. And I was actually covering it for my then website. And it just dawned on me, like there's so many people in this genre and demographic that I think could benefit from a lot of the things I had been reading from both like spiritual avenues and coping skills and therapeutic different takes on that. So yeah, it's kind of a wild concept, I guess, but like, I'm like, no, horror and healing. And that's been a big part of my own foundation in my life is horror movies. And I've gone through the ringer, man. I'm a recovering alcoholic, major depressive disorder, all this stuff. I've done other things, but horror has helped. So.
Chris, it sounds like you're a compassionate artist and you were thinking, okay, let me take some. Most people would just go to a horror film just to have the living shit scared out of us.
Yes.
It seems like how you approach horror films, my guess is that's how you approach life. You see beyond the veil. Like, what's the question behind the question? What's the message behind the message here? And how can I take what's impacting me and share it empathetically in a way that is deeply meaningful to other people?
Yeah, really well said. And with my books leading up to this one, that's kind of what I had done. I tried to integrate passions of mine like skateboarding and hardcore and punk rock music and hip hop, but in a way that also explored mental health and healing. And coming back to Necessary Death, I knew it at the point I'm like, this could be a cool book, but I also recognized my own limitations. And that's where Preston came into the picture because I had read his first book, Our Lady of the Inferno, which I absolutely loved, and had him on my podcast because I wanted to get to know him better, explore the book. And then after talking to him, we chatted after, and I kind of presented him with this idea that I'd already been working on a little bit with my literary agent. And I'm like, man, I know it's kind of crazy, but what do you think? And Preston, I'll let you pick it up from there, man.
Yeah, and it seemed like the perfect thing for me because I really wasn't working anything at the time. The book had just come out, and I have kind of an unusual route to being a published novelist. I went to college for criminal psychology, and I was of this generation that grew up on Silence of the Lambs and CSI and came of age thinking that we were all going to join the FBI and become Clarice Starling and hunt serial killers. And then I got to the end of my degree plan, and by that point realized that it's a lot more interesting and a lot more fun and maybe a lot more psychologically healthy to read about and watch and write about that stuff than to live with it every day. And so I decided, well, I've got the degree, I've got this professional background, this academic background. I'm going to parlay that into writing about this stuff rather than actually making that career. And years went by, and I didn't really get an opportunity to use anything that I had learned academically in school from that psychology program. And then Chris pitched this thing to me, and it's like, we both love horror movies. Chris has this background in self-improvement and mental wellness. I have this educational background in it. I love horror movies. It seemed like the perfect fusion, and it seemed like the perfect challenge to me because it wasn't quite like anything that I had ever done before. And so I jumped at it. I said, yeah, let's do this thing.
It is so cool. Something that's come up in the conversation so far from both of you is the subject of mental health, which a lot of people seems increasingly are struggling with. I don't know what the link is between horror and mental health. I know when I was 5 years old, my stepfather forced me to watch The Exorcist from beginning to end. We had a kind of a weird family, to say the least. I know that didn't improve my mental health for like the next year or so. I was kind of like afraid to go to sleep. But are we talking about psychological distancing? What really is it within a horror film that approaches the subject of mental health or can be even useful?
I love how Preston responds to this. I'm going to let him tackle this, and I'll jump in. But Preston always is so eloquent about this. So Preston,
I can't wait.
Yeah.
Next to fantasy and maybe certain subgenres of sci-fi, horror is the genre that lets you do anything. To crib the ad copy from the original Hellraiser, there are no limits. There is nothing limiting you narratively, creatively on what you can do in horror. And if there's nothing limiting what you can do, there's nothing limiting what kind of themes and ideas you can explore. There are certain genres that require a little bit more literalness in the approach to it. You cannot have shape-shifting Lovecraftian abominations bust into a Ingmar Bergman like social drama. You cannot have alien beings who are attempting to infiltrate the political system on Earth and usurp it pop up in Kramer versus Kramer. But you can have that in The Thing. You can have that in They Live. And because you can do anything, you can look for any types of, you can utilize, from a creative standpoint, you can utilize any types of themes. You can look at literally anything through that. And if you can look at anything through that, you can look at ideas of self-improvement and mental wellness and well-being through that.
That is brilliant. When you were describing that, the thing that popped into my head was Albert Bandura's work on social cognitive theory and vicarious experience. And I was thinking about what if people find absolutely horrifying? And in his research, it was snake phobias. And I couldn't even imagine if I was one of these people. I'm kind of indifferent to snakes. I'm not scared of them, but I don't have any affinity for them. But if I was terrified of snakes, I couldn't even imagine myself being anywhere near one. But through systematic desensitization and viewing someone vicariously handling a snake, making these little micro steps that are not so alarming that they actually they throw me into complete inaction, by the end of the experiment, I find myself much further along, even handling a snake. And 24 hours ago, that wasn't even possible. And it seems like, wow, I'm watching this scenario, which is terrifying. It's the whole point of horror, right? So if I'm watching this terrifying situation unfold, I'm scared, but I know relatively I'm safe. And I can imagine myself being put in somewhat precarious situations without the stress levels being so high that it incapacitates me.
Yeah. I love that you said that about snakes because I had a healthy fear of snakes for a long time. And over the last several years, I fell in love with hiking. And when I would see snakes, which you do when you hike, I'd get really nervous. I actually almost stepped on a black rattlesnake once, and that scared, the bejesus out of me. But what I found was the more I was encountering these snakes, the more I actually would stop from a distance and kind of watch them and start to really appreciate just how interesting of creatures they are. When it comes to horror, you're sitting through and confronting something terrifying. If it's a good horror movie, it's something that's going to scare you. But for me, that's part of that's part of doing the inner work, is looking at the difficult things that scare me, really like going into that. There's this, it's kind of cliche, but it's so true to me. The only way out is through. And I believe that. And that's part of why I know for many years of my life, I spent numbing myself in drugs and alcohol because I was terrified to look at myself inside. And once I started doing that, it's not easy, but it got easier, whether it was talk therapy or EMDR therapy, horror movies, for example. I started realizing, wow, I'm confronting a fear. I'm watching this, and I'm watching this brave character, like a Final Girl, for example, which is usually a female lead that makes it to the end of the movie and typically survives the bad guy, the last standing woman. Like, I could relate to that. Not that I've ever had a monster chasing me, but in a way, a metaphoric monster with drugs or alcohol or life. You know, life throws so much at us. But to me, I don't know, I see things very much outside of the box. And that really, it would inspire me in ways. And yeah, I also like to be scared. Like, it's a dopamine rush. You know, I won't find me on a roller coaster, but you'll certainly find me watching the new horror movie. No doubt about it. So.
I think you captured the essence of all personal growth, confronting that which scares you, confronting that which you would rather not.
Yeah.
And you talked about, well, the lead. So she gets to the end. Everyone else died, but something about this particular character outside of chance and luck caused her to endure and survive. When we're watching horror films and we're talking about gaining insights into our own strengths and capabilities, my assumption is it's almost a little bit like self-coaching. Like, what were the attributes? What were the actions? What were the decisions? What were the innate qualities and strategies that this person used to escape from a situation that for everybody else was inescapable? There's also a sense of dose response. What creates the link between watching a horror film and taking tangible action in the real world within your life?
Preston, you want to jump on that one?
Yeah, you actually hit on something. I believe it was Wes Craven who said that horror movies are a sort of mental boot camp, and they give you these ideas of potential different situations that you can explore through the narrative of the horror movie and that you can sort of prepare yourself for facing in the real world. And that's kind of what Chris and I explored with this book. For example, the first chapter is about the Nightmare on Elm Street films. And no, none of us are ever going to come up against undead dream demons who want to slaughter our teenage children in their sleep. But the Nightmare on Elm Street films are very much movies about self-actualization and about finding ways to confront difficulty in our day-to-day lives and not only overcome those difficulties, but use those difficulties to find self-actualization and become our best selves. We are not going to come up against a man-eating shark that wants to annihilate an entire small town, but Jaws is a great demonstration of realizing the limitations of your own capabilities, reassessing those limitations, and finding alternate resources in order to overcome situations that face you. I've said this in other interviews we've done before, life in many ways is a horror movie. It is a struggle and it is a battle, and it is about waking up every day and facing the challenges and the obstacles that are set before us. And so by contextualizing our daily difficulties and our daily struggles through something fictional and something narrativized that has a concrete, many times positive conclusion, I believe that most, or if not all, of the films that we used in this book have ultimately happy endings. We can find ways to identify with those characters and identify with those situations and then utilize the skills that we have learned through them in our own personal lives.
It's a different genre than you usually would examine it through, but it's the classic hero's journey, it sounds like.
Campbell, yeah.
God, I love this conversation. I knew I would. My wife is a filmmaker, and sometimes she tells me a little bit too much. Like, I don't want to know how the cake is made. I just want to know it tastes good. I don't want to know how they got that shot, how they said, you're really ruining the magic for me. But one of the brilliant things about living with a filmmaker is after a film, we talk about it for hours on end and we dissect it. Not from a technical perspective, but from a very intra and interpersonal perspective. There was this one study years ago about the nuns of Mankato, and they had a disproportionate number of centurions, but it's different than the blue zones. the researchers traced their mental acuity at an advanced age to one central belief, that an idle mind was the devil's plaything. They didn't do anything differently. It's the way they went about the same things that we go about. So if they would watch a film, which they would, watch a TV show, which they wouldn't just take passive input and allow that film to impress upon them. They would discuss it in depth. They would debate it. They would extract the lessons from it. And that's the way they approached everything in life. It's almost like, I don't believe how you do anything is how you do everything, but I don't disbelieve it. What's been a film that has really made an impression on you? And what was your ritual or strategy around that film that you can share with others?
I mean, there's so many, but I always, especially in relation to this book, go back to the original Halloween film. John Carpenter's classic. I mean, there's a number of others. If we weren't talking about,
just saw that.
Yeah. It's a tried and true for me. When I first saw it when I was younger, and the subsequent numerous times thereafter, I didn't necessarily process it in a way that was any more depth than Halloween's my favorite holiday. There's a really cool masked killer in it, and I just love the aesthetic, and the music was amazing. But when I started getting more into my spiritual journey and meditation and things like that, it definitely changed the lens through which I see a lot of life. And I started also reading about psychology and Jung and shadow self. And Michael Myers to me is just what a incredible representation of this. Like, they call him the Shape. That's his nickname, just this moving being entity type thing. And to me, like, when I've done shadow work, it's almost to me like Michael Myers. There's this part of myself that's just moving, and it doesn't necessarily know why it is. It's just like an unstoppable force. So I liken that to Jung, and I sometimes maybe I take some liberties, but it's fun for me, and it makes sense. And then I'll tie that into, like, I love to read about physics and, like I mentioned, spirituality. I love to just explore things that really help grow the way I process and experience life. But for me, Halloween was a big one.
So. I want to touch on that. There's a couple of things I want to touch on. So this is hard for people to do, but it's necessary. And you talked about Jung, you talked about shadow work. You also mentioned identifying, but we tend to like to identify with heroes. Mm-hmm. But I think what I'm learning from this is the value in horror films is it's a safe space to play with identifying with the villain, because we all have those shadow characteristics. As much as we like to see ourselves as heroes, and we are at multiple times within our lives, some arguably a lot more than others, we're also the villain if you take a snapshot of our life in a single frame at any one moment at the wrong time. And the more we can identify and be clear with the villainous traits that we possess, the more we can start to draw a line in the sand and create the opposite, become the antagonist to that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'll just quickly to say, because I want to hear what Preston's movie is, but one of my two root teachers is Ken Wilber, and I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he's
I am. Brilliant.
Okay, so he's Ram Dass is my main teacher, and Ken Wilber is my other. And Ken wrote the foreword for my second book, and wrote actually a nice little endorsement for this one. He's been a longtime friend of mine. But one of the earliest, very simple gifts he gave me was, he said, "Grace and grit are just two sides of the same coin," and so that allowed me to start accepting and working with and acknowledging, I have this other side of myself, the light and the dark, the shadow, like it's all part of this being that is called Chris. And it's okay. It doesn't need to be negated or shunned or bastardized. It's a part of me. I can work with it and re-own and reintegrate it in a healthier way, which is what I'm passionate about. And that's part of the reason of this book. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Just wanted to share that. But Preston, I want to.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because something you said a moment ago really hits on something. Are you familiar with Carol J. Clover and Men, Women, and Chainsaws?
I'm not. I need to be now.
So she's this academic, and she wrote this book. I want to say it was in the 1980s, if not the very early 90s, and it's called Men, Women, and Chainsaws. And it looks at a variety of psychological and sociological themes through the lens of horror movies. But she is actually the person who coined the term final girl. We can actually trace final girl back to Carol Clover. And her idea was that we come to the horror movie for the monster, but we stay for that final girl. And that even though we may think that the monster is the aesthetically cool part of the film and the interesting thing and the thing that holds our attention, our identification is never with the monster. It's always with that final girl. And when we finally get down to that last sequence of the movie where it's between her and the creature, very few, if any, audience members are ever cheering for that monster they've ostensibly come to watch. They're cheering for her. And it's because the split has occurred where we are her, we are the human, we are the average individual, and whatever anxieties or troubles or predatory forces in our lives there are, that is the monster. And so there is this not quite cognitive dissonance going on, but there is this disconnect that we're here to initially root for this one thing, but then we want to see it go down because its downfall is ultimately a victory for ourselves. And I just thought that was very interesting what you said a moment ago, because it reminded me very much of her ultimate thesis in Men, Women, and Chainsaws.
Love that.
I love that as well. So 30 days after reading your book, how will I not only look at horror films quite differently, which I assume I absolutely will, but what do you think, I want to hear from both of you, are some of the key takeaways from that book that will start to create a shift in me and the way I engage in my life?
Well, my part of the book, what I love is, Preston wrote this really just incredible, brilliant. He would start off the chapters, and I'll let him explain more about what he did with it. But I would pick up from there and bring kind of more of that human healing aspect. And what's always very important to me in all of my books, and this one included too, is offering various coping skill practices, various meditation practices, things that I've directly experienced that have benefited me. And I like to include an eclectic mix because I honor that we're all unique, quirky individuals. And that's what makes us incredible human beings. So just because this practice worked for me, I know that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for you. However, if that doesn't work, here's a slew of other things, from different wisdom traditions or different, psychological approaches from, I try to incorporate something. I want to believe, I really do believe that there's something for everyone in there. And not only in the chapter actually about horror movies, whether you're a horror fan or not, but, there's a lot. Every chapter has a practice or something for the individual in an accessible way that they can start integrating that into their life that day. Change starts, it can start right now. So
there's kind of like, there's kind of two psychological paths. There's the psychological framework of utilizing horror films as a blueprint for self-discovery and how you interact with the world around you. And that takes time. And then there's the immediate tools that you can take and use to alter your state in a positive way and shift your perception of what's happening around you now, today.
Yes. And that's what Preston so beautifully did in his part. So I'd love to hear Preston talk a little bit about what he, did in this book.
Yeah, we kind of divided it according to these two lines. My section of each chapter is called "Oh, the Horror," and Chris's section is called "Oh, the Humanity," and put into psychological terms that really becomes kind of theory and practice. And I tackled the theory end of things, and Chris tackled the practice end of things. And from a theoretical perspective, I'm looking at these themes within each of these movies and doing something between a psychological analysis and a film study guide. So looking at how self-improvement and self-actualization is explored through the Nightmare on Elm Street films, looking at how misdirected rage is explored in the Candyman films, looking at how themes of toxic relationships are explored in The Predator. And then Chris was taking those theories and those ideas and putting them into practice for how people can use these ideas in their everyday lives. What I hope shifts people's perspectives is that they start to look at movies that they've seen dozens of times in a new way, that they start to maybe peel back the layers of an onion and look at them from different perspectives and different angles, and that they maybe start applying that to other movies as well, beyond the ones that we've discussed here, that they start looking for different themes of psychological complexity and different ideas in other favorite films of theirs. And then also I hope that I get people interested in general psychology a little bit more. I name dropped a handful of psychological theorists who have been influential to me, and I hope that it gets people wanting to expand their horizons and learn a little bit more for themselves.
I love the combination of immediate practical application and theory. You hear a lot, not from everyone, to be fair, but you hear it quite a bit, where someone will drop a post on social media and talk about the uselessness of theory and the practicality of what can be applied and used. And in my mind, you can't have one without the other. If you don't sit with something and understand the context of something, you're not going to have longevity around a tool that you're utilizing for very long. And you're not going to use the right tool in the right moment for the right reason. The most you can do is apply the right tool for somebody else's reason in their moment, because you don't have the context on your own that you've developed through sitting through this theory and trying to work it out. And what does this mean? And more importantly, what does this mean to me?
That's why I love, there's such an importance, as far as I'm concerned, in critical thinking and discernment. That's so important, using rational mind. What I've found that complements that so beautifully, at least in my life, is also the practice of mindfulness and meditation. And I talk about this in this book, and I talk about it in all of my books. But, sometimes I will play mental gymnastics over things. I'll do my best to, like I said, critically think and process something, have that discernment. But that's up here. And the equanimity, is when we bring the mind and the heart into balance. And to me, that's where I can't go wrong. When I process things and thought about it, but then kind of lay that aside and allow that innate inner wisdom, which is for me a very, very real thing. And I will have deeper insights that I don't know where they come from or what they are. I'm not a woo type of person, and nothing against people that are. Celebrate your weirdness. That's amazing. I love that. But I have had so many really incredible direct experiences where I'm just sitting in meditation or nature mysticism. Or before I got my herniated disc, I used to love running, and I would go out 8-10 miles, 5-6 days a week. And like once I'd hit 4 or 5 miles, man, all these incredible insights would start happening just naturally. I wouldn't intentionally be thinking about things. They would just start flowing for me. So I find, again, equanimity, that balance of heart and mind, is such, for me, the most skillful way I can show up in the world as a human being, and just try to be a good person that lives with accountability and integrity, no matter what the situation is. So, yeah.
I love that. I think the hardest part of COVID for me was I spent 20 years on the road. So I was speaking all the time. So my life was the next event. And I've had a pretty traumatic past. And I realized that even though I loved my work, I loved what I was doing, I loved who I was doing it with, I loved who I was doing it for, there was kind of an element where I was staying so busy with work, it stopped me from really examining myself. It stopped me from doing an in-depth self-reflection. And then when COVID hit, I had no choice because I was stuck with myself. And it was like, oh, wow, there's a lot of stuff here that I don't like. And there's a lot of stuff here that I needed to address. And there's a lot of things where I filled in the gaps and told myself a lot of stories that wasn't necessarily true. I don't know why I'm seeing so many horror films lately. It's not like I'm seeking them out. I was at an event with my wife, and we stayed over in this city. And Friday the 13th, part 1 was on. And I hadn't seen that since I was a little kid. I saw way too many horror films when I was a little kid. Maybe that's why I'm the way I am now. Who knows? But anyway, this isn't a psychology session. It's a podcast. And I thought to myself, this is so much scarier than when Jason Voorhees was introduced. because they kind of kept the identity of the killer secret until the major plot revealed towards the end. And you're filling in all of this terrifying information, not based on what's presented, but what's being withheld.
Preston, I know this is your jam right here.
Yeah, this is really fascinating for me because my wife and I were discussing this not too long ago, why the first Friday the 13th movie was so subversive when it came out and why it still has this lingering sense of unease and discomfort to it. And for anybody who's listening to this podcast who grew up with Jason Voorhees as this kind of domesticated monster, it's hard to grasp that when the very first Friday the 13th movie came out, it was considered incredibly upsetting. It was basically like if today somebody had taken a snuff film and released it to theaters through a major studio and given it its full marketing campaign. This really upset people. This upset people to the extent that they were publishing the home addresses of people who featured in the movie and encouraging people to send them hate mail and basically doxing them. And what we ultimately realized was that they did something very provocative and very subversive and something very transgressive with that movie. It came out kind of right there at the tail end of the whole porno chic boom. This came out not that many years removed from middle American theaters showing straight up X-rated pictures at the cinema, from, Deep Throat being shown at your friendly neighborhood movie theater as opposed to some dark, skeevy porno show in the bad part of town. And you look at the way that the actors in the original Friday the 13th look and the way that they're dressed, and you look at the way that movie is structured, it is a porno chic film where the stars get murdered. Mm. And that is an incredibly transgressive thing to do with a film. And you have these connecting sequences where it's young, sexy people hanging out in the woods in skimpy clothes, and then they're either about to hook up or they actually hook up, and then they get killed in really gruesome, violent ways that audiences were not used to seeing death portrayed in a horror movie at the time. And it is this very provocative blending. And I've probably said provocative enough times in this interview that if you're doing shots for every time I said it, you'd be dead right now, but whatever. And it is this fusion of sex and death that I think we kind of take for granted now in horror movies, but which at the time would have been incredibly upsetting for audiences who had never come up against those two ideas in the same context before. And there's this idea, there's a website called TV Tropes that looks at different recurring tropes and themes that pop up across different pieces of media, across different cultures and mediums. And one of the ideas that they propose is Seinfeld isn't funny anymore. And the idea behind this is that the jokes of Seinfeld and the phrases of Seinfeld and stuff like the super Nazi or Elaine dancing are so familiar to audiences who have never seen Seinfeld before that if you were to take somebody who was very familiar with the tropes of Seinfeld, but not the show itself, and actually show them the series, they may not find it funny or interesting as somebody who watched it in its first run or somebody who wasn't exposed to these ideas anymore. And I feel like it's something very similar with the Friday the 13th movies and with post-1980s horror cinema in general. It's sort of taken for granted that there's going to be this weird fusion of sex and death, but that had never really been done to such a visceral extent as when that first Friday the 13th movie came out. And there is this great, brutal collision of the idea of the Eros and the Thanatos coming together in these deeply upsetting ways happening there.
Mm. So when you say we've habituated to the type of things that you would see in your traditional Friday the 13th movie, what was disturbing back then, and of course in a family-oriented after-school special sort of way, was, there's a question here, and it's not fully formed in my mind. Was it what we were seeing on the screen that disturbed us? Or is it somehow what was revealed on the screen exposed something we didn't want to see in ourselves?
I think it's more of the sort of experience of the uncanny. Nobody watching an adult film in the late 1970s was expecting its stars to get slaughtered at the end of a sex scene. And you took this very familiar thing for audiences of the time, and then you did something very upsetting and unexpected with it. And I think that that put audiences in an unsafe feeling space and gave a lot of moviegoers probably what was one of their first very visceral encounters with the uncanny.
Yeah, okay. So while we habituated to things like Friday the 13th, what was the next horror film that did something truly unique and expanded the genre? In your mind.
It didn't get they didn't get seen by a lot of audiences at the time, but I would say The Thing and Videodrome. And I would even say that the newness and the uniqueness and the boundary pushing qualities of those movies are why they initially faltered at the box office. And I don't think that audiences in the early 80s were ready for what those movies had to do and say, and that culture had to kind of catch up with them. I can't remember what critic it was. It might have actually been multiple critics who said that maybe The Thing faltered because it came out pretty much on the tails of E.T. or right there before E.T. And here in this emerging optimism of the Reagan age, you had this very optimistic tale about an encounter with an extraterrestrial being who's this very sweet little, loving botanist from beyond the stars who becomes friends with a little boy versus The Thing, which is this incredibly gruesome, I would argue, AIDS/HIV metaphor. And audiences were ready for one of those things and not the other. And the thing that they were ready for was not the HIV monster. And then similarly, Videodrome is this tale about contemporary isolation and the dampening effect of media and going back to Friday the 13th, that's almost a spiritual successor meta commentary on Friday the 13th about the increasing fusion of sex and violence in the media and what that can potentially do to a culture. And so I think that those two movies after Friday the 13th, they're kind of the next steps in this emerging cultural conversation that was going on in the beginning of and then throughout the 1980s.
This is going to be a hard question. Apologies in advance, or it might be a really fun one. Maybe a little bit of both. I have a personal belief that we don't truly understand ourselves divorced from the context of other people. It's my interaction with you that helps shape my identity around who am I. If you were going to write a horror film that was a commentary on the state of affairs in the world today, what would that plot be like?
Oh my gosh.
I told you it's going to be fun and difficult. I just had to. Just for play.
Wow. Man, Preston, I don't know. What do you got, man? That's whew.
I almost want to say it's Lady the Inferno. I really had a lot of contemporary struggles and ideas going on in my mind when I was writing Lady the Inferno. And I think this is true for a lot of people. I can contextualize what's going on in my life now through what has happened to me in the past. And I need some time and distance in order to really properly gain perspective on things. And that's even one of the reasons I set it in the 80s, is because I felt I couldn't do a horror story looking at contemporary struggles in the present day. I had to contextualize those things through the lens of 1983.
This isn't an original idea. I love that, by the way, Preston. One of the articles I wrote for Fangoria magazine, which is where Preston and I actually met kind of through there, was I wrote an article about Joker with Joaquin Phoenix and how, to me, that was an absolute horror movie. Now, you won't see it ever labeled as a horror movie, but as someone who has lived with mental health issues for the majority of my life, and worked in that field in varying capacities, and also personally know people to this day that struggle a lot with that. Watching that film was jarring for me. It was a brilliantly done film, in my opinion. I love Joaquin Phoenix in that role. I'm really excited for the new one. But yeah, that was, to me, commentary on this world. It might not be like the larger political issues, but it is that subjective human experience. And to me, it doesn't get scarier or more apropos for horror than, again, like really the decline of our mental wellness. Because when that starts to go, I mean, I currently work now in a setting where I'm working with dementia and Alzheimer's patients and schizophrenia and other things too. But watching individuals' brains eating themselves to the point where they're not going to be functioning whatsoever, like that's terrifying to me. Like, talk about scary. Horror movies are scary, but like what I go in and do every day, that's to me scary. It's also beautiful and hopeful and poignant at times. But, when I get really real about what I'm seeing day in and day out, God forbid that ends up happening to me or my loved ones, because that is no way to end your experience of this really incredible human thing. This, whatever it is, I don't know, but it's pretty amazing and difficult and terrifying. But yeah, so Joker.
I think those diseases are the most dehumanizing experiences, robbing you not only of your capacity for thought, but your dignity as a human being. It's an abomination. I remember watching The Joker. I loved the film, not in a happy feel good way.
Right.
It's quite disturbing, but I thought that was a poignant commentary on, because we talk about like politics and all of these systems and structures, but we don't here's where like you have all the theories on different ways of managing and leading and governing, but I experience them as an individual. And sometimes people are under the enormous weight of these systems and how they break down and affect that person. I think when I was watching The Joker, there was a lot of parallels between his upbringing and my upbringing, so that caught my attention. But I remember walking out of cinema and thinking, wow, this is going to disturb a lot of people, because a lot of people don't want to realize that in any way, shape, or form, they are part of a society that creates monsters and then punishes those monsters for being monsters, or maybe even more of a transgression, not being a monster, but by being a monster, you are ripping a hole in the veil of an illusion that we are collectively working very hard to maintain around the story of who we are. And when you show us who we are not, that's almost an unforgivable sin.
Yeah.
But you have to accept that if compassion and empathy is ever going to take place, and it's ever going to be generated from you as an individual, not to mention a society.
Yes. That's, to me, like what comes back up again is my meditation practice. I've been at it for about 20 years. And I remember when I stepped onto that path thinking, oh, it's going to be love and light and rainbows and unicorns. And it was anything but. I likened it to like a Freddy Krueger nightmare at times for me. It started to, in a way, I started getting to know Chris and what makes Chris tick. And it really started to dismantle this carefully crafted foundation that I had built around what I believed the world was, and the way things are, and wow. And I'll also say transparently, leading up to that, I'm sure plenty of psychedelic experiences I'd had also helped shift that. And I think that's another conversation. But after all of that, and then sitting down and really going into these deep meditative states and coming out, that was what a gift. But at the time, it could be very jarring too, like really. And I tell people there's a Buddhist scholar, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who's like, it's better to not step on the path, because if you're going to, you have to go all the way. If you don't, you're just setting yourself up for, oh my gosh, neuroses and traumas. And, there's no, to me at least, and from what I've learned from my teachers, there's no real half-assing it. That doesn't mean don't learn to be gentle and compassionate towards yourself and others. But it's going to ask everything of you, really, if you're willing to embark on this. And I use the word spiritual, but let's just say the human experience, the healing journey. If you're really going to show up for it, like it's going to ask everything of you. And that doesn't mean we do it all at once, but we do it each day, a little by little, some days more than others. But again, that's just been my experience. In no way am I saying that's the way it is of the world, but that for me, and that's my truth. That's my direct experience. I know I just went a lot of different ways there.
No, I just have so many questions. and I think that's something that a lot of people intuitively, when they hear that, it resonates with them. There's a truth to that. I'm thinking about one of Bukowski's essays where he talks about if you're not willing to completely give yourself over and surrender to, he was talking about being a writer, but much more than that, because writing wasn't writing for him. It was the only path that he could go down. And I think that's what he was saying. When something screams out of you, it's the only thing you can do. You cannot not do it. That's when you know you should. For any other reason, don't, because you won't fully commit yourself to it. What does, I know you talked about this, you explained it, but what does going all the way really entail?
So first, I love you mentioned Bukowski, because he's like probably my favorite writer. Absolutely love that man. To me, like another quote that came up while you're speaking, one that I love is where he says, God, now I'll butcher it because I'm on a podcast, but essentially it's like, we're here to live our lives so well that death trembles to take us, and I actually shared it the other day and I'm butchering it. But the point of that is, like, to me, that is showing up and doing the work, like, because when I do that, then I'm able to live my best life. And that doesn't mean I'm rich or famous or have fancy cars or six-pack abs. It means I wake up and I am content, and I'm okay with Chris. I've struggled with self-esteem and like I mentioned, depression, all sorts of things. Today, it's a lot different. And I'm so grateful for that. But I had to show up and still show up every day to do that work while having that spirit of compassion and gentleness with myself, and also having to push myself sometimes to do it, but finding that balance. So to me, that's commitment. That's going all the way. I won't have gone all the way until I cease to exist, right, in this incarnation. But so going all the way is a one day at a time thing. It's a daily reprieve. It's a daily, for me, taking inventory of like, where could I have been better? What could I have done better? What did I do good today? And like really, again, just getting to know myself better and better every day. And not in a way that I'm obsessed with myself, but so that I can show up in the world and offer the most skillful version of me to everyone, to me as well, to me and to the people I work with, smiling at the stranger on the street. That's going all the way, I guess, for me.
It's interesting that you use the word contentment, because in a lot of self-help, the word contentment doesn't show up. And I don't think you used it in any way, shape, or form to reflect pleasantness, if you will. Right. What I was hearing there was authenticity, because so often we do things with such vigor in order to get to a certain state. And it's the exact things that we're doing that robs us of the present moment experience and any endpoint of being happy and being the way we want to be. It's almost like we are aiming for something. And while we're aiming for it, we are doing everything we can to completely miss the target.
Yeah.
God, that's really interesting. It's like, okay, just being the authentic version of me and working on that and living within that space without comparison.
Yeah. I love that you said that.
Or not defined by comparison.
Yeah.
There's always going to be comparison.
Always. And who doesn't love to feel good? That's like I said earlier, I love watching horror movies because I get dopamine rushes. I love hugging people because it raises my serotonin and dopamine levels. Like it feels good. But, at the same time, I also have lived at such low levels in my life through addiction and things of that nature that I'm grateful for those experiences, because contentment is a-okay with me. A sense of calm and peace, not feeling great or elated, which again, those are very nice feelings. But if I can go through my day and it's the majority of it is like, I'm okay with this. What a gift. What a gift for me. Yeah.
Well, for you and for others. Because I know I had brought up that it sounds like horror movies. Like, of course, any story follows the meta myth and the hero's journey, basically. When you go through that transformation, when I'm the only one that safely emerges from the woods and everyone else was just slaughtered by a maniac, it's safe to say I am a different person leaving the woods than I was when I went into them. You cannot not be transformed by an experience like that. But that person, whenever there is a part 2 or a sequel, like Nancy and her journey in Nightmare on Elm Street, she became someone who held space and was a source of strength and guidance for others. It's always, whether you intend it to be or not, who you become at the end of a journey impacts other people, your community, your family, your society, whether it's the person you're rescuing from the tower, whatever. And what I'm thinking about is watching a horror film. It's like, wow, what attribute did the protagonist demonstrate, and what's most admirable, or what is the greatest point of commonality between who I want to be and who that person on screen was? Obviously, I'm not going to go, fight a spiritual entity, but if I was just 5% more, courageous, self-sacrificing, whatever what would that look like? What would I do differently when I emerged from that forest after, okay, I hopefully got help and saw a therapist and chilled out for a while? How would I engage in the world if I was just 5% of that? What would 5% look like? What would be the behaviors?
Preston, I've been rambling, bud. You want to chip in?
No, it's a brilliant idea, and it's something that I think that we as a culture are starting to get interested in now. I worked for several years as a acquisitions executive at a production company, nominally reading horror scripts. And I would see these different plot ideas and these different narrative trends repeat over and over again. And something that I started to see a lot of was movies about the person who has survived a slasher. And to avoid copyright infringements, all of these screenwriters had created their own monsters and created their own slasher villains. These movies were all picking up with the people who had gotten away from the monster and what life looks for them after that. And I think the big way we saw this realized in the real world was with Grady Hendrix's Final Girl Support Group, which came out a couple of years ago. But it's a provocative idea because that's nothing that we ever really get to see explored in a lot of horror franchises outside of Nightmare on Elm Street, and to a lesser extent Friday the 13th, which had Tommy Jarvis coming back. But Tommy Jarvis was a different character every time for all intents and purposes. I barely count that. But that's something that I love with Nancy. And then later, I'm going to lose so many points right here. Alice, is it Alice that's the secondary protagonist who comes back in 4 and 5?
Yes, with the blonde hair.
Yes. Yeah. That's what I love about the movies in that series is they do look at the fallout of that. And it's in a horror movie, in an action movie, in a lot of movies, it's never we beat the bad guy, we saved the day, life becomes normal now. These are transformative experiences. These are things that would inherently change a person. And so I like that we as a society now are starting to recognize this in the media that we consume, realizing that extraordinary circumstances would result in extraordinary change, and that we're more interested now in asking what does happen next and what impact does that have on the protagonists of these stories.
As we come to a close, I just want to say you guys have been fantastic. This has been such a fascinating discussion. I know that a large percentage, if not everyone, is resonating with either the entire conversation or various aspects of it. Where can we get your book? Where can we get more information on the two of you?
Yeah, the book is available everywhere books are sold. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, IndieBound. I think really anywhere. If you want to support your local bookstore, I know they can order it for you. And then I'm just on social media, just my name, usually with the letter X before and after it. So just X Chris, GROSSOX, and that's it for me.
Yeah, and I'm mainly on Twitter these days. Preston Fassel. all one word. And apparently I have an Instagram account now, because if you have a Facebook, it's automatically generating an Instagram account. So if you want, you can look for me there. I'm not really active there, but I'm apparently there.
You're there. I follow you.
Brilliant. Well, stay on for a second, and thank you very much for listening to another episode of the Self-Help Antidote. And thank you, gentlemen. It's been
Thank
great.
you for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Visit us at theselfhelpantidote.com to share your feedback, insights, and recommendations on what topics you'd like us to explore in the future.